are three of the brightest luminaries in the field right now, and it is with enormous pleasure I will introduce the first one. Dr. Genevieve Bell was awarded her PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University in 1996. Instead of pursuing an academic career, Dr. Bell went to work at Intel, where she has spent 20 years exploring the rapidly growing intersection between computing and culture. And that work has led to 13 patents, numerous awards, and in 2015, appointment as the first female senior fellow in Intel history. In her role as the vice president, is it senior vice president or vice president? It's just vice president of the Corporate Strategy Office, Dr. Bell has worked ceaselessly to help humanize the technology that touches us every single day. And beyond being amazingly accomplished, I am very proud to have called her a friend for the last 5 or 6 years. So please, let's all welcome Dr. Genevieve Bell.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any magic fairy dust to open conferences, but I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land I am happy to come back to. While Mark can describe me in lots of ways, I'm also an Australian born in Sydney, so it's always nice to be home. Though I realized in listening to all the introductions, I have become very American because I don't remember how to say data properly. Data. It's going to take me a long time to remap that. So I thought what I would do today, I realized looking at the program, there are many people who are going to talk about IoT, both the Internet of Things and the Internet of Impact, in more traditional ways. I wanted to kind of take the opportunity of being the first speaker to expand our thinking just a little bit. You should imagine this is less a formal presentation and more either a provocation or a meditation, depending on how you feel about those things. Most of us who are in the IoT space know that we've been talking about this for a long time. Mark and I were laughing last night about just precisely where IoT is on the Gartner hype curve. At the top, heightened expectations, somewhere down into the trough of disillusionment. It's kind of hard to tell, but all of us know that the figure 50 billion connected things has been floating around for a long time. The problem with a number like that and with all the stories we tell is it's really hard to find a different way into that. We say 50 billion connected things and your mind just kind of glazes over a little bit. And I thought, well, what are some other ways that we have into that future, right? What are some other ways that we could talk about that story? And so I want to kind of take us on a little bit of an adventure and a journey. And of course, you know, you have to reasonably ask, who am I to do that? Well, Mark gave me a lovely introduction. I am, in fact, an anthropologist, but I'm also the daughter of an anthropologist, and I grew up on my mother's field sites in Central and Northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. Good time to be a kid, excellent place to be feral. I wore no shoes. I got to speak an Aboriginal language, and I got to hunt things and kill them and then eat them. In America, that usually produces a great deal of fear in people. In me, mostly nostalgia. I see goannas, and there's one in this presentation, and I get hungry. It's probably not the best response ever. And it's an incredibly long way from Ali Kurung in Central Australia to Silicon Valley. And as Mark said, I came there via way of Intel and of Stanford. And frankly, some of you in the audience know I got my job at Intel in true Australian fashion because I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998, and one thing led to another, and I didn't marry him, but I did get a job at Intel. So I've been at Intel for a long time. My job there has really been to connect the dots and to think about how do you put people back into the story of talking about technology. Over the last couple of years, my job's also been about how do we think about the future, not just the present. How do we think about what it is that people are doing with things and how might we make sense of all of that? Which means that I think a lot about the future too. Now, the thing about the future is most cultures have spent time trying to manage the future, right? Because if you can manage the future, you can better marshal your resources, you can better think about who are your enemies and your friends, when to plant crops, when to marry off your children. Lots of reasons to control the future, right? Or at least to have a point of view about it. And most cultures had people who thought about these things. We called them soothsayers, fortune tellers, the Oracle of Delphi. In the 21st century, I think sometimes we think of them as economists. But there's lots of ways of imagining how do you think about the future. And in many of those older societies, one of the things we looked to tell us the future was animals. Whether it's augury and the entrails or the movements of animals have told us something about where the future was going. And I want to suggest they can do that right now too, because it turns out animals are on the same journey we are of moving from analog to digital. You may laugh, but it is true. Starting in the 1960s, particularly in the United States, trickle-down military technology was put on animals as a mechanism of thinking about environmental safety. and thinking about endangered species. The first little trackers were put on all manner of endangered species in the United States so that we could track habitat loss, track those animals, and provide protection for them. And it was relatively straightforward, simple technology. But in the last couple of years, that technology has gotten the same transformation that we see in more traditional IoT spaces. We have gone from GPS trackers to fine-grained tracking with real-time data analytics, with real-time cameras, with sort of narratives placed on top of all of that. And even to the point where we see it in the kind of more whimsical spaces. This is a tech journalist in the UK, Kate Bevan, who IoT'd out her cat, Daphne. That's Daphne. Daphne has an IoT collar and a smart door. So when Daphne comes through the door, it takes a picture of Daphne coming through the door and posts it to Twitter. Should you want someone to follow on Twitter, Daphne Flap, as in Daphne's cat flap, is an excellent follow, and suggests a kind of way of starting to think about what is the range of stories here, right? Because all of us see the same news stories. Every day there is a news story about something not quite so sensible in IoT. Whether it is the man who spent 8 hours trying to get his tea kettle to give him tea, which seemed to be there this morning, there are stories of kind of IoT not quite making it. But I actually think there are things we can thread out of this that are useful for how we think about it. And you can follow the technology just as one way of doing it. So here's the lizard that clearly makes me hungry. One of the things that's happened in connecting animals is we've gone from tracking to real-time cameras. This is from a project out of the University of Texas. This is a guy who really likes lizards and spends most of his time in the Great Victorian Desert in Western Australia, chasing around Gould monitors, so big lizards, and Velcroing things to their heads. So awful. And you can see the Velcro, which always just makes me faintly anxious because I know that there's basically Tarzan's grip underneath of that holding the Velcro on. The promise here is, of course, that we will see the world in an unmediated fashion from this animal's eyes. Pause here and think about all the other ways we have been promised an unmediated view, that somehow if we attach a camera to it, it becomes real. Of course, what this is also trading on is a particular kind of prurience and voyeurism, and some interesting notions about if you could see where the animal is going, do you really know how the animal is? Do you have an insight into how that animal behaves? There is an entire collection of these things called criticams if you suddenly feel a need, not while I am speaking or while anyone else is speaking today, but at the end of the day, you can go to National Geographic's website, and they have an aggregation of all animals with cameras attached to them. And it's a lot of animals. Turtles, bears, snakes, lizards, anything you can stand still long enough to Velcro something to its head, there is a camera attached to it. And there's a whole place of these, right? But clearly there's more going on than this. It's not just about attaching cameras, it's about how do you start to think about data analytics, big data, and the stories that go around it. And some of them started pretty benignly with cats. And here what's the interesting piece is less about the cats and more about what got revealed when you started to track them. So in both the United Kingdom and the US, 2 experiments went on in parallel, putting RFID tags and cameras on cats. Discovered a couple of things. One was run by the UK Veterinary Society, so I'd say relatively high integrity of the data. The other one was run by a newspaper, so, hold those 2 things in your head. What it turned out, and you can see here the maps of the cats, and they did it over a week's period, 24 hours a day, was that the cats are actually negotiating space. They don't go into each other's space. You saw negotiations at the edges of space. And that seemed nice. What became much more interesting was that it turned out 1/3 of cats in this study went somewhere else than the home that was their primary residence. They went to a secondary residence where they also seemed to be fed and taken care of. In Britain, this came under the headline in the BBC, "Cats have secret lives," which was excellent. It turns out in their secret lives, both in the UK and America, and frankly we know it is true in Australia too, that indoor-outdoor cats are also predating on Australian and other people's wildlife. What the cameras revealed in America was that cats killed pretty much everything they ever came across, but only brought about 1/3 of it home. American cats also went somewhere else other than their own homes. When this story turned up in the American press, it went under the headline, "Killer Cats of America." What this tells you is same data, different narratives. You can have the same data, but someone will produce a different story of it based on all manner of things. What is also clear here was that the data started to challenge how people thought their cats were behaving when they couldn't see them. This should be a familiar story because it's one we frequently wrap around the promise of IoT. Cows, another thing that got IoT'd pretty quickly, here mostly about the story of productivity. So Fujitsu Siemens has a project in Europe to track cows, mostly, or cows, not bulls, to track cows because their gait reveals whether they are fertile or not, so that you can increase the productivity of your farm by knowing this and determining how to then cover your cows. In the UK, cows were being tracked to see their gait because when their gait became unstable in a particular way, they fell over. That technology was seen as having useful affordances into the human population. When we age, falling over is a big deficit, so if we can start to monitor falls, that would be interesting. The one that most grasped my attention, however, was the combination of IoT on animals and IoT on buildings and infrastructure. It comes out of the United States, where in upstate New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire, people started to both RFID tag their cows and create automatic milking machines. What ended up happening was that the cows would come to the automatic milking machine, it would trigger the gates, you would come in, lasers, yes, lasers, would adjust the milking machine onto the udders of the cow and then automatically milk them. It takes about a week, apparently, when you introduce one of these machines for cows to work out they can milk themselves. And then something really interesting happens. Cows go from being milked by humans twice a day to when they can milk themselves, they milk themselves anywhere between 3 to 6 times a day. Any one of you who has been a nursing mother might understand why that is. The notion that you would only basically breastfeed twice a day because that was convenient for everyone else is kind of a horrifying thought, and the cows manifested this fairly quickly by going, excellent, we can milk ourselves. Now, of course, that meant the machines paid for themselves very quickly, but it also renders visible a piece of knowledge that was a little bit complicated, which was cows' desires. And the notion that suddenly the data let us see something we didn't know before, that the cows' desires might have been in conflict with the logic of capitalism. And there's something fascinating in all of how that might manage itself. And of course, you can well imagine for a whole lot of people, they desperately wanted to know what the cows were thinking, because who doesn't? And so a bunch of students in upstate, Canada, produced an art project, a critical art project, that basically then imagined what the cows might be thinking. And frankly, as we imagine what IoT objects might be thinking, the notion that one's left back udder is not functioning as well as all the others could well be the story that you tell. But here what you also start to imagine is that even animals get subjected to the kind of speculative fiction that we continue to subject IoT to. And that runs rampant even in the sheep space. So, you couldn't tell a story about the future without mentioning sheep because, well, Philip K. Dick. Do androids dream of electric sheep is one of the earliest sort of moments of how we might think speculatively about the future. Turns out sheep are in all IoT in one way or another, partly because they raise some really interesting challenges. IoTing sheep, that could be a verb. IoTing sheep is actually quite complicated because of cost. And because usually, as we know as Australians, there are a lot of sheep. And so putting a tag on all sheep is a much more expensive proposition than tagging some cows. The people who are speculating about how you might tag sheep have some interesting stories to tell. In Wales, there is a project ongoing, which frankly, Minister, might be an interesting one to contemplate here, about using sheep to create ad hoc wireless networking access. So sheep has wireless cloud. Because sheep move, lots of sheep in Wales, poor connectivity, should sound vaguely familiar. IoT tag sheep, send them off. Now, in Australia, I could see the drawbacks of that was you'd get connectivity in places that maybe there weren't any people, there were just sheep. But it's an interesting thing to contemplate, right? In Australia, the stories about sheep and their position in stories about the future is about, can you start to track the way herds move? And will the movement of herds tell you about vulnerabilities, predation? Could you start to create models of that the way we have modeled things like swallows as a way of starting to think about that? And of course, there are academic researchers, particularly in the UK, my colleague Anne Galloway, starting to speculate about what is the relationship between animals and humans, and how do we think about the next generation of technology as not just being human-computer interaction, but human-animal-computer interaction, and how does the complexity of all of that play out? Least we think it's just about big things, it's also very small things. I noticed my colleagues here from Data 61 and Cyro are here. In partnership with Intel, they have had an ongoing project to put RFID tags on bees. I did ask the man who's running this project how he did that, and the answer was very carefully. See again, superglue, which seems to be a running theme through how you attach things to animals. Of course, once you start tagging bees, again, what becomes clear here is that some of the ways we have understood bee behavior gets challenged as soon as the data is produced. And one of the pieces of data that comes quite clearly out of this study is that bees are not quite as straightforward as we once imagined. Where we once imagined that bees went to one queen, one hive, this data starts to suggest bees may go to more than one hive, still have one queen but multiple hives, which helps to start unpack some of the challenges around environmental challenges, around hive loss, but also starts to suggest that some of the ways we have modeled the known world might just be that, models. And that what we start to have to do is work out how do you manage data and models and what the implication of those models are and what the data is that's being collected. Because sometimes it isn't always that straightforward. You don't collect the data and then intuit the model. Sometimes you start with the model and then you have data, and actually working backwards and forwards through that is high complexity. In the IoT space, we also know it isn't just about big scientific projects, productivity, and efficiency. Sometimes it's about other kinds of ways in. In the US 2.5 years ago, someone had a Kickstarter project. So think here of citizen science and crowdsourcing around IoT, and again around birds, in particular about snow owls. So 3 winters ago, there was a proliferation of snow owls in the United States and Canada, and they started coming down much further into the US than they'd ever been seen before. And some basically citizen scientists went, oh, there's a snow owl on my beach. Never seen one of those, should find out where it's going. And decided that what they should do was capture the owl, build a little harness for it with RFID tagging, and release it back into the wild. Decided that they shouldn't just do one, but many. Decided they might need some money for that, and so crowdsourced a project called, possibly not particularly imaginatively, Project Snow Owl, which you can still find, where you can basically sponsor an owl. Now, what was interesting about this is twofold, right? One is that not all IoT projects are going to be about government agendas, and not all of them are going to be public and private enterprise. Some of them are actually going to be much more speculative and driven by citizens' questions. And that creates interesting challenges, right, in lots of different ways. In this one, part of what got revealed, again, unsurprisingly, was that owls went where no one knew they went. Owls really liked person-built infrastructure. So they were very happy hanging out on buoys or buoys in the ocean, because that was an excellent way of extending their range. They liked fishing boats too. So the kind of notion of how have animals adapted to human infrastructure became part and parcel of it. It also turned out that whilst in the contiguous North America you have Canada and the United States, that border is actually a technological border, not just a cultural, social, and national one. Because when the snow owls went to Canada, they disappeared. Like, poof, gone. And for a while, the science people went, uh-oh, owls with backpacks dead? Like, what happened? No, it turned out that the Canadian cell tower infrastructure pings the network at a different rate. And so the owls were invisible for protracted periods of time, when they'd reappear somewhere else and people couldn't work out how they got there. Now, of course, what that starts to suggest is even as we think about IoT, the underlying infrastructure and how it is configured is a critical part of the questions we ought to be asking. And it's not always clear what that looks like. And then we have the challenge of how might you even feel about this and what are the consequences going to be? And frankly, as an Australian woman of a particular vintage, where would I be if I couldn't have a Monty Python reference in a talk too? So Albatross, 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 Albatross. Turns out that albatross are also an animal that has been tracked for a very long time. Back in the early days of tracking, albatross are subject to incredible environmental conditions. They are vulnerable to fishing boats and trawling technologies. We lose about 300,000 albatross a year. It's kind of a calamity in many ways. People started to think, could we raise people's consciousness about this issue? So think IoT for good here. And the answer became, well, maybe what coming out of the UK was bet on them. Something as Australians maybe we could recognise. And so Ladbrokes in the UK started a betting pool on the albatross, tracking them from Tasmania to South Africa. 20 started, many people were enlisted, including the grandson of Coleridge. Irony, 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 you know. And then, of course, what happened was that none of the albatross survived. 4 got there the first time, the second time none. It becomes quite difficult to run a betting pool when no one finishes the race. And rather than asking the question of, uh-oh, what does this tell us about the environment, they just decided this was a bad way to speculatively bet and went on to something else. Of course, what this also starts to suggest is one of the challenges about IoT is that it will tell us things we already know and about which we have already chosen not to act. So imagining that the technology has agency to change our behavior is a fairly complicated assertion. People knew the albatross were already in danger. Making visible their danger did not, in fact, change behavior, but it did change the albatross behavior. I have colleagues of mine who work with albatross and who describe the following scene in Wollongong, basically, off the coast there, where albatross turn up on the edge of the boat, put out one leg, and start squawking, because they fully understand that their blood will be taken, they will be tagged, and then they will be fed fish. So they understand the ritual exchange here. All good, right? Imagine where we might be of that as human beings. What is the ritual we are performing that is not dissimilar to that? What is the quid pro quo we are already socialized into, and how might we think about it? And of course, last but by no means least in this little hasty run around IoT animals, you should imagine that animals are also part and parcel of the complexity of social media too. not just IoT, data analytics, and the narratives we tell about efficiencies and infrastructures. If you tag animals, you also make them visible. And so in 2014, this photo started doing the rounds on social media that basically said, if you take a photo of these rhinos, please remember to turn off your meta tagging, because you are making visible where these rhinos are and making them vulnerable. In the same year, tigers, Bengal tigers, who were wearing collars in order to be tracked for environmental reasons, someone hacked the trackers, tracked down the tigers, and killed them for sport. So part of the challenge here is, as we think about what it means to be connected, it's not always quite so straightforward and simple, right? How you think through the consequences of positionality, real-time data, and all the complicated web here, right? If the rhinos are not posting their own locations, it's not like they're taking selfies, but someone is taking pictures with them. So here's this sort of this additional set of complexity, right? So what do we do with all of that? Well, as I started by saying, there was a time when augurs and soothsayers read animals, right? We looked at them, we thought about them. In many places, we worshipped them, we traded them. They were our monetary value. They helped us make sense of the world. And I want to suggest they still might. There is something in all of those stories that tell us a little bit about what it will be like, not just to live in an internet of things, but an internet of living things. Because what they reveal is a whole set of pieces of complexity, right? They tell us a little bit about infrastructure, which is what we already know in some ways. It is uneven. It is always complicated. They tell us a little bit about what are the logics by which the Internet of Things will be deployed. Is it about efficiency, productivity, science, knowledge, perhaps a little bit of whimsy? Is it about the production of data? And is it about things we didn't know, things we already knew, things that were hiding in plain sight, things that we know and choose not to act on, irregardless of how many times we are told about them? So there are some interesting kind of complexities that run through all of this, right? And then as a social scientist and a researcher, I will tell you one of the other things that really strikes me here is that animals don't have a lot of consent. They're not opting in or opting out for this, right? I mean, you're not going up to the cow and saying, hi, mind if I tag you? And this building too. Not happening, right? But it also then means, where is consent? What does it mean to opt in and opt out? What does it mean to think about data privacy, how data is used? What does it also, frankly, reveal about the models by which we make sense of the world on which we are building IoT deployments? So the bees in one way, but also the owls and the cats and the cows all suggest to us that we have ways of thinking about the world. We have normalized certain kinds of relationships, certain ideas about time and access, certain ideas about how things configure. And we are building deployments on top of those models. But maybe we ought to take a step back and ask some questions about those models. What have we imagined is normal? What have we imagined is true? What I think in some places are we imagining is right? Because I think there is a moral overlay frequently in these things. And then where is it that we configure power in all of this? Who is it that's doing the deployments? Under what circumstances? Governed and regulated by what? What does it mean, particularly for the animals who move across boundaries because they don't have passports or citizenship or need to know that they're in Canada, or somewhere else? And what if all of those things weren't just about connected animals? What if they're about all the other living things that will connect to the internet, principally in some ways us? We can talk about smart cities as though they were an abstract thing, but we will all live in them. How will it mean to think about that? Will you have a contract when you come into a smart city that says, yes, I agree to be tracked? And what would it be if you said no? How would we manage that, right? So there is a piece that runs through all of this that says, if we imagine not just an internet of things, but an internet of living things, what are the questions that come into sharp relief that as technologists, as creatives, as regulators, as innovators, as entrepreneurs, we should think about not after we've built the deployment when we go, uh-oh, that wasn't what we intended, but before we build it. Where are the moments where we think about what are the considerations? How do we think about what we should ask of our regulators and of our institutions about how all of this works? Because otherwise, the Internet of Living Things, I suspect, becomes acritical. And for me, there's something in particular that is much more important about asking what will all of this be like, and how we might ask the questions about what it will feel like, what it will be like, and where we have, as, again, citizens and technologists and entrepreneurs, both the responsibility and the opportunity to do something a little bit different. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.
Brilliant.